Okay, well, thanks for clicking play there and joining us for our conversation with Professor Jennifer Bird-Pollan of the University of Kentucky Law School, who wrote a law review article that caught our eye and about which we have written in the Giving Review a little bit ago, and we'll talk about that. Professor Bird-Pollan is also newly, I think, an associate dean at the law school, and therefore busier. I think maybe we can ask her about that a little bit. Professor Bird-Pollan has been at, do I say UK law? UK law
yeah,
since
that's what we say.
2010. Where are you from? Kentucky? Where's home?
No, I'm not from Kentucky. I grew up in Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay. And what happened? How did a nice Pennsylvanian end up in Kentucky where you are and have been?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to have this conversation. The law teaching market is a competitive process, and you sort of throw your name in a hat and see who draws it out. And I did interviews all over the country, but I was pretty excited to join a public law school, and one that was committed to its state. I'm a big believer in public education, but the other thing is that my husband is also a faculty member. He's a philosophy professor. And so the place that had great offers for both of us was here in Lexington. So we moved our two, at the time, relatively young kids down here, and we've been here ever since, very happily.
What do you guys talk about at dinner? Philosophy or law or tax law? Actually,
these days, it's more like who's driving who where and where our kid's going to apply to college. But other than that, it is a fair amount of philosophy and tax both. I think that, as I'm interested in both of those things. So that's, yeah.
And where did your interest then in tax law arise from?
Yeah, so I did a graduate degree in philosophy first. Actually, I went there right out of college, and I didn't finish it until much later, but I started it before I went to law school. And in graduate school, in philosophy, I was interested in questions of distributive justice. That's what I was interested in. And I was reading all the philosophers thinking about, sort of best forms of government and how society should be organized and what we owe each other and things like that. But I was always a little frustrated in philosophy because I felt like we asked those big questions, but we didn't necessarily answer them in ways that sort of hit the ground, that had like purchase in the world. And so I decided to go to law school. But I didn't necessarily, I hadn't identified taxes where that was going to happen, but I was interested in tax anyway. And I got to do a reading group as a 1L with a great tax professor named Dan Halpern, who I actually talked about in that article that you guys read. And which is unusual, right? 1Ls don't usually get, first year law students don't usually get to do tax. But it confirmed for me that that's where my interest was. And I basically never looked back. So it would have been great to love practice, but instead here I am.
Yeah. And did your interest in nonprofit tax law predate the art? How long have you been paying attention to the nonprofit aspects of tax law?
Yeah, so I definitely was interested in it in law school. I took a couple of interesting classes in law school that crossed over the nonprofit area, again with Hartmann and others at Harvard. And then in practice, I practiced at Ropes and Gray in Boston, which has a robust nonprofit practice with some really amazing lawyers. So I got to do some of that work then, and I think here at UK, I've taught estate and gift tax, which not exactly nonprofit, but has certainly implications and overlap because that's a lot of what people are often thinking about when they're doing their estate planning. So my interests have been sort of around the edges of it for a very long time.
Yeah. So the article we've been referencing was in the Pepperdine Law Review, I guess earlier this year.
Yeah.
And is about the excise tax on investment income of certain higher education institutions. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? This is unfair, right? Can you boil your law review article down? Whatever. Give it a minute, but
oh, absolutely. You should be able to give an elevator pitch.
What is that tax, and why do we have it?
Sure. So it was interesting because the article was part of a symposium that then got canceled because of COVID. It was supposed to happen in March of 2020. And it was about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So, sort of looking back at the tax a couple of years later. And the piece of the law that I really wanted to explore was this excise tax, which was, the first time we were seeing a significant tax on nonprofit income, as opposed to some other kind of, we do, of course, there are a variety of taxes assessed against nonprofits, but this was, an income that otherwise would have been exempt from tax. And it had been a topic of conversation, certainly at universities. It was important, highly talked about here in Kentucky because of Berea College, which is one of the colleges that would have been subjected to the tax, but has, it's very popular in Kentucky, and it's not sort of what you typically think of when you think about those rich universities. So that was the motivation for my interest in the topic. And then, so the tax is a relatively low rate tax on income earned by certain categories of universities with endowments in excess of, it's not a fixed number, it depends on the number of students and the number of assets that are used for what they call exempt purposes versus what are basically investment assets. And it's been around since 2018. Universities were able to get an interpretation that allowed them to only look forward. So they marked their assets to market effective the beginning of the tax and are only paying tax on any income earned beyond that. But I think, part of the reason I think the tax is so interesting and important, and as I talk about in the article, is because it is the first time that we see Congress sort of willing to look at some of the an endowment of a big nonprofit and think about it as potentially subject to tax.
So what might we see more of this? Should the Ford Foundation be worried, or, using them as an example, which they're being used as, I know, but what does that tax mean for potential other taxes on endowments to include in the philanthropic foundation context?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because I think on the one hand, I think universities were a place that Republicans, who of course had control of Congress and the presidency at the time, were willing to start, because I think they weren't necessarily as politically popular with certain constituents as maybe other kinds of nonprofits would be. But of course, we did see it at the same time, lots of conversation about foundations controlled by people who were otherwise politically active, right? So I think maybe it is a time to, so if you think back to what a nonprofit looked like 50 years ago, or maybe even shorter, right? Maybe we only have to look back 20 or 30 years. The dollar amounts are just dramatically different from some of the dollar amounts that we're talking about now. And so you could explain part of that by saying nonprofits have grown. There are foundations that are doing work all over the world in a different way than would have been contemplated when we were talking about local nonprofits in the past. But even when we're talking about things like universities, the size of the endowment, the amount of money that we're talking about is just so much larger than it ever was before. So I do think that turns people's eyes, right? It turns people's eyes both, at the sort of the basis explanation, revenue raising. People are always looking for where can we get additional revenue, tax revenue. But then also, if you wanted to question what is the justification for nonprofits in the first place, and then you see nonprofits that are accumulating significant amounts of wealth, I think it raises in some people's minds the question of whether this is consistent with what we have historically meant when we said this is a nonprofit that ought to be eligible for an exemption from income tax.
Mm-hmm. The 69 Act governing this area, I'll say, was the result of anger, really, I suppose, right? A reaction to perceived violations of the word charity, oversimplifying there.
Yeah.
You think was the 2017 tax on the result of the same sort of I'll say cross ideological anger, or who was part of the coalition? I know the Congress was controlled by one party then with a part. Was this a cross ideological reaction against higher education? And could the same perhaps happen again now?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and I mean, the fact that it's targeted only at universities when we know that there are endowments that are generating significant amounts of income in other kinds of nonprofits, right, does make it seem like the subject was chosen on the basis of some ideology, right? Because there's nothing in the statute or the legislative history that says this is why universities should be subject to this and not, for example, private foundations. Well, they're subject to different rules, right? But why not hospitals? Why not? I mean, where else are there significant endowments? Museums. We could think of examples where maybe there are comparable sized endowments that were not going to be subject to this tax. So yeah, I mean, I think it's not sort of codified anywhere what the justifications were, but I do think if we sort of think around what the rhetoric was at the time about universities, and continues to be true, frankly, right, that you can see reasons why people thought that was an appropriate target for this tax.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to form you a tax law professor into a political prognosticator, whatever. But if I'm going to criticize, it's pretty easy for me to criticize Harvard if I'm a conservative policymaker, much like a candidate. Yeah. Isn't it as easy to go after, to criticize, to wonder whether there should be exemption for big liberal foundations, whatever I would want to use? I mean, how is it too easy? In fact, how easy? And then relatedly, how did Berea get out of it? And, because they're smaller, I mean, how did Berea get out of it? And can't I, if I'm a critic of big liberal higher education, whatever the phraseology used was, doesn't the same criticism apply to big philanthropy?
Yeah. So I think one important distinction to make is between public charities and private foundations, which are subject to different rules. So the universities that we're talking about are all public charities. And so they're not subject to the private foundation rules, which require basically a distribution of a certain amount, right? A minimum spending of the endowment every year, or of the income anyway. So in a certain sense, the public charities maybe felt like an easier target because they could accumulate without a minimum requirement of distribution, and the private foundations, they have to be spending something, right, in order to continue to qualify and in order to get their tax exemptions. So, but sure, I mean, I think you could set the same sorts of parameters. Maybe if you thought that certain kinds of foundations were growing too large, you could say, above a certain threshold, maybe the spending requirement goes up and we tax you if you don't spend at least 10% or 15% or something like that, instead of just the 5%. So I think you could absolutely apply similar kinds of reasoning to foundations, right?
So why don't we end part one there and just pick up with part two right on the other side and talk about Berea, among other things?
Absolutely.